Greetings, everyone. My name is David Woodall from Emsdale Pastoral Charge of the United Church of Canada, and I'm sharing with you this message as we head into the week of Easter. I'm sharing with you this message from my workbench in the basement because it feels to me like the Word of God arises out of the work we do every day. It's not hidden, it's real, it's not decorative, it's truth. And so that's why you can see my workbench in the back. That's why I'm sharing with you from this place. My inspirational passage for today is John chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. It's the story of Mary at the tomb. Jesus has been crucified, was laid in the tomb. She went to take care of his body. 3 days after he died, only the stone's been rolled away, the tomb is empty. Someone's stolen the body as far as she's concerned. She has no idea what's going on. Until a gardener speaks her name, only it's not the gardener. When our life stories lead us into the darkest places of life, it's God's story. However you choose to spell or pronounce the name of God, the name of this wild, wonderful spirit that crosses continents and cultures, language and time, that causes us to love and sacrifice for each other. It's the story of the Spirit which speaks to us in this April of 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, amidst the physical isolation and social distancing that keeps us apart, at a time when we so want to be together. When our stories lead us into the darkest places of life, it is God's story, this resurrection, that overtakes us and brings us hope. For our common humanity on this tiny planet, this story proclaims that we, all of us together, are the people of hope. And today that's what we hold on to. This God-given wisdom is a hard-won wisdom. I imagine Mary at the tomb on that day, and I think it looks something like this. Mary, frozen in pain and anguish, obvious in the way her slender young body slumped against the outside of the tomb. You couldn't miss it in the way she stared off into the distance with a vacant, hopeless stare, looking at nothing in particular, seeing nothing. You could read it in her sagging shoulders, in her disheveled robes. You could see it in her wind-blown hair, her red and puffy eyes, the tear stains on her cheeks. She stood there as if paralyzed at the tomb. All of us know about crucifixions, about loss. The loss of friendships, the loss of employment, the loss that comes with moving and living in a new place, the loss of a close friend or family member, the loss of each other in the face of this global pandemic. And sometimes the grief has been so much that it's left us paralyzed. The death of a father or mother, the death of a son or daughter, the death of a cousin or a neighbor, the loss of our normal everyday world, and the advent of an unknown future. We stood with Mary at that tomb, paralyzed with grief, remembering the unforgettable times that seemed like short days ago. For Mary, it was the evening when she took the oil of 1,000 hopes and poured it over Jesus' feet. The warmth, the laughter, the promise of a future that looked so bright and good. Like the others, she was certain that Jesus was going to go places, perhaps even become a king, and she was going to go with him. But now, she stands outside the tomb and cries. We stood with Mary at the tomb and said goodbye to life before the coronavirus. Goodbye to gatherings with family and friends. Seeing relationships become strained and disappear. Sometimes we even said goodbye to hope. And we wonder, how will we get through these days? We wonder, how could life ever return to normal? How could it ever return to normal after what we've been through? And as this loss registers with us, we become paralyzed. We can become frantic. We wonder if this awful pain, this awful moment, will ever pass away. Anyone who knew Mary's story would understand. They would know that inside the tomb where Mary's hopes lay was simply a pile of old cloths. What only days ago looked like a bright and promising future now looked like a pile of stinking old clothes, here one day and gone the next. Sometimes life can hold a great deal of pain for us. Ours is a hard-won wisdom when we call ourselves the Easter people. When we say that the resurrection is greater than the crucifixion, we say that from experience. We know that Mary's story does not end in that pile of clothes. We know that her paralysis of grief suddenly changes. We know that Mary's story becomes God's story. And we know that all of those plans and dreams, all of her hopes, all of our hope was resurrected from that pile of cloths where Mary heard her name, spoken by what appeared to be the gardener. As humanity, isolating, fearing social disruption, wondering, grieving, as humanity, when this is our story, isolated, fearful, bewildered, in grief, this is God's story as well. Too often in our lives we think that we're simply alone, that we are in some kind of dead end. We find ourselves vacantly staring off because there's nothing here for us to focus on. The loss has gripped our hearts so badly that at times we're frantic with dismay. But ours is a hard-won wisdom. We know that the resurrection is greater than the crucifixion. We know that there are times when we so much want to hear God's voice speak into our lives, and somehow this God of many names speaks to us. God speaks into the shadows of our lives, and our lives come back to life again. God speaks into the shadows of our world, and our world finds new hope where once there was only death. Our stories don't end in the pile of cloths lying in that tomb. That pile of cloths, it could be so many things. It could be a dead frog lying in a pond, a grim reminder that pollution is destroying our world. It could be the isolation schedules that bring order to our pandemic lives. It could be the crippled woman that I visited in the hospital. For years and years, she couldn't do anything. She couldn't even feed herself. Yet every time I came and visited with her, her joy, the spirit of her life, her laughter infected me. It spoke about this breathing hope, a wild, wonderful spirit that spoke into the shadows of her life. Her story became God's story, and it becomes our story. The voice of God speaks today into the shadows of our country with images of hope and help and caring. The voice of hope speaks through the incredible heroics of healthcare workers, grocery clerks, first responders, and you and I at home, because this is where we can best help and serve. The stories of our lives become God's story, whether we want them to or not. God, however many letters you use to spell that name, this wild, wonderful spirit is for all of humanity, the religious and the non-religious. The story of the resurrection crosses all barriers, all prejudices, and brings us the gift of hope. This resurrection is God's gift to the world. We're not the people of the crucifixion. We're the people of the resurrection. We are the people of hope. We are the Easter people. Our symbol is an empty cross and an empty tomb. There's a great painting hung in an art gallery in London, England. It's the artistic rendering of the story of Faust and the deal he made to sell his soul to the devil. And in this painting, Faust is sitting on one side of a chessboard with only 3 pieces left on the board. He's staring, and the sweat is pouring down his face. He's desperately trying to find the move that will save his soul. Across the table from him is Mephistopheles, the devil, with a board full of pieces, grinning and laughing in anticipation. The title of this painting is called Checkmate. Jeremiah Wright, at the time a minister in the United Church of Christ, tells a story of being in a tour group going through this museum. The tour guide stops in front of this particular painting, talks a bit about the artist, why it's such a significant painting, what's it insured for, and how much it would cost today if it was to be replaced. Then the group moved on to the next painting. The tour group was not aware that an older gentleman from Russia hung back staring at that painting. The group moved on to the next painting. The man still hung back, pacing away from the picture and then returning to it. Then the group moved on to the next gallery, and they were 2 galleries away when the booming voice of the Russian echoed down through the stone corridors, as only sound can echo in those kind of old buildings. "It's a lie," he said. "It's a lie. The king has another move." The tour group didn't realize that this Russian gentleman's name was Kasparov, and he was a Soviet chess grandmaster. But they all heard his message. It's a lie. The king has another move. When Mary stood outside the tomb, paralyzed by grief, Christ spoke out of the shadows and said, "It's a lie. The Spirit has another move." When you and I become lost in these days of self-distancing, at wit's end about what to do, in despair of the future, and the grief of today, this wild, wonderful Spirit of life speaks out of the shadows and says, "It's a lie. Hope has another move." And people all over the world begin to think new ideas and begin to do things in different ways. For one moment right now, the whole world is pulling together in the same direction, seeking health, building community in new ways, knowing that we are one humanity on one small speck of a planet in a massive universe, pulling together. That sounds like hope. We're the people of the resurrection. We are the Easter people. This is God's story. Who else but God could give us such a wonderful, life-giving story?